Okay, doors closed, so we are going to go ahead and get started. This session is jQuery tips for the Visualforce Developer. So it may seem like a silly question, but just a baseline, how many jQuery developers do we have in the room? Okay, so if you didn't raise your hand, we are going to baseline jQuery a little bit at the beginning, and then I'm going to give you some just sort of heads up things in Visualforce you should know. Whoa.
Sorry.
I'm going to let Jason work on that. Just a few heads up, the things you should know in Visualforce, and then I'm going to hand things over to Jason, who is going to show you some things that they've been working on when it comes to using jQuery within Visualforce itself. Now, it's Tuesday, so you've probably seen this a few times now. This is our safe harbor slide. If you haven't heard the pitch already, it basically goes, if you're going to make any purchasing decisions, please make them based on current features and future-looking statements I might make. I don't think I have to make any future-looking statements, but it seems like whenever I say that, that like poses a challenge to somebody to ask me a really weird question about lightning or something. So everything we're showing you, however, should be generally available right now. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Joshua Burke. I'm a developer evangelist with Salesforce.com. That's just a fancy way of saying that I hope to have happy developers and more of them tomorrow. You can catch me on Twitter at Josh Burke, and that's actually a really good way to reach out to me. I find that the 140 character limit really suits my attention span very well. And allow me to introduce back to the stage Mr. Jason Venable. I'm actually very happy to be presenting with Jason again. Jason and I have had a tradition of talking about jQuery and Dreamforce in the years past. Jason was actually the first session I managed for a Dreamforce as a Salesforce employee, and unfortunately we missed the chance to do this together last year. So Jason, back to the stage. Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
Thanks, Josh. So I am Jason Venable. I work at ArrowPoint. We have an ISV application on the App Exchange. But I've also just been doing Salesforce development for about 8 years now. jQuery, Apex, APIs, you name it on Force.com. I've probably touched it at some point in history. I just kind of want to share some of that knowledge with everyone today. So go ahead, Josh.
Sounds excellent. Okay, very basic. Most people in the room already know, but just so that everybody's caught up to speed, what is jQuery? jQuery is a JavaScript library for manipulating the DOM of your page. The DOM is what controls all the node, is how HTML, JavaScript, and CSS can actually talk to the page that is being rendered. And jQuery allows us to manipulate that in a way that is also cross-browser and very friendly to use. And what you're going to see a lot today is this. $ being jQuery's global method. That's actually going to come up in one of the tips that we're about to talk to. And typically what we're going to do is we are going to look at some kind of a CSS selector. So when you look at a CSS page, you see how all the CSS is formed. Same basic format goes here. So this is saying jQuery, go find me all the divs with a class of headlines, and then do something with it. Maybe it's attach an event, change a CSS, grab an attribute, change an attribute. Or we can talk to objects. We can say jQuery, go talk to the document. And in this case, what we're actually doing is document.ready. And document.ready is one of the most common functions we use with jQuery because it actually allows us to talk to the DOM once the structure itself is ready. So it's faster and more efficient than using, say, window.onload or body.onload because those have to wait for all of the assets of the body to be fully loaded. Whereas all jQuery needs to know is that the DOM structure itself has actually been loaded into the page. Now this is going to look very basic, but this is actually, I've had long conversations about what we're seeing on this slide and whether or not a developer should do one or the other and what the impact can be. And so it's one of the things that when you're doing like a demo or you're putting your code together for the first time, it's probably nothing you need to worry about. But as you go into production, it's really good to know how Visualforce is actually getting the JavaScript that you're going to use on the page. The first thing you need to do to use jQuery is actually have access to jQuery, right? And so we have two main flows. One is just using a CDN, a file that's hosted out there on the internet. If you're going to do that, you want to make sure you're using HTTPS so that you don't get any weird browser HTTP to HTTPS style conflicts. Or you can also have it up as a static resource and pull it right down directly to your page from your actual Salesforce instance. You can also use a direct script tag, or you can use Apex include script. And include script will do two things. One, it will force the script to be up in the header. It will also check for duplicates. So for instance, if you've got a Visualforce page, you've got a template, you've got a component, this component uses jQuery, this template uses jQuery. If they're both using include script, you will only get one version of jQuery embedded on the page. And so it does a little bit of management for you. However, on the flip side, some developers like to make sure they know exactly where the script is going, right? Like maybe they want it towards the end of the body for performance or something like that. So the script tag gives you more control. Include script does a little bit of management for it. My preference, this is not something I can give you like a strong recommendation, like always do one or always do the other one. My preference is to use the top one if I'm sharing code and I'm doing demos, because it's one less step a developer has to do in order to get my demo up and running. I don't have to worry about whether or not jQuery is a proper static resource. And then I usually use the second one here when I'm actually going to put something like in production, because I like to have a project that's all one repo with all of its working parts and moving components and things like that. Now, Jason, when we were talking about this, you actually had some different insight based on experiences you had as an ISV.
Yeah, so one of the things we see is just kind of, he mentioned this earlier, is just the way they load the scripts on the page. It's a minor detail, but it's important to note. Include script puts it in the head. Script just loads it wherever it is on the page. Like as that page is loading, as it's downloaded, it hits that script tag. That's when it'll start to pull in the resource. And that's important to note because sometimes when you're in an application like Salesforce.com, you've got lots of different applications running in there. And Salesforce is actually fixing this with the whole Lightning framework and the ability to or they removed the ability to embed sidebar components, but there's thousands of orgs out there, and we have our app package in thousands of orgs. And one thing we've noticed is that sometimes someone will build a sidebar component, HTML, they'll include jQuery there, you'll include jQuery in your page, and they'll start to conflict because they're loading at different times. Yours might be loading in the head, theirs might be loading in the body. They just stole the context of your basically jQuery variable that you were using in your application. And so using a script tag gives you a lot more control on exactly where that loads. So we always put ours at the bottom to make sure we're the last thing that loads so that we're always in control. That's getting better, but there's lots of orgs out there you need to be aware of. And so that's one thing we've noticed when we install our application in thousands of different orgs.
Now, using that as kind of a segue, it kind of comes, this is one of the most primary tips that I think every Visualforce developer should know about jQuery. Many of you in the room are probably already doing this. However, in that same vein about the fact that we have JavaScript libraries that are kind of running around the Salesforce environment, and especially if you're going to use Visualforce as like a dashboard component or as a page layout component, and maybe trying to play nice with a lot of other JavaScript that we already have embedded there. We use other JavaScript libraries at Salesforce to do things like generate the interactive tables and the list views and things like that. JavaScript, as we all know, is not exactly the world's most strongly typed language, right? And the $ is what makes jQuery do everything. When we say jQuery, go grab these document structures, that's all $ based. The problem is another JavaScript library may already have $. It may already be using $, and the last person in gets to redefine it, right? Like if you want to break all your pages, do $ equals false. It'll be hilarious, trust me. So a way around that is you can actually, jQuery has an internal method to fix exactly this problem, and that is no conflict. So if you assign a variable to jQuery.noConflict, from that point on, jQuery's main method will be whatever you assign that to. And $ will actually no longer work. It'll actually no longer refer to the main jQuery object. Now, if you were doing an interface that has no outer structure to it, it's not in Canvas, it's not in page layouts, it's not in dashboards, you won't really see this problem. But my recommendation is to stay in the habit of doing this anyway, because kind of the way the Salesforce development ecosystem works, you never know when that really awesome mobile-friendly graph that you just created, somebody decides they want to convert it over to a dashboard, right? And all your good testing and production and all that stuff, it worked great on the mobile device, and they bring it over to a dashboard and suddenly it just blows up. Costs nothing, very simple to do. Just get in the habit of doing it and wrap everything that you're doing with jQuery within a no conflict. Probably the biggest crime that Visualforce does is it tries to render too much on the page, right? As Visualforce developers, we've probably run into this over and over and over again. And right now, I think a lot of Visualforce and JavaScript developers are kind of in this interesting space where we have projects where we're dealing with existing components or existing structures and existing layouts, or you may have projects which are completely greenfield and you can just control that interface, right? And that latter, I'm seeing more and more where we're using frameworks like Angular or Bootstrap or Backbone, and you have full control over what the HTML is doing, and you're controlling the CSS, and this is less of a problem. But if you have existing Visualforce pages which are generating a lot of components, and you're trying to find that component within jQuery, Visualforce is actually going to try and get in your way. And the reason is because it needs to know when we convert that data list to an actual table, it it has to be very comfortable that it's finding the ID. And so I don't know if you've ever pulled up the source, but it's always this J01002 Apache Bravo something, 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 and then the ID that you actually wanted to find it. jQuery also has a relatively simple solution to that because it has supports for partial selectors. And so if we put in ID star equals the list, it will ignore that whole J01002 Apache Bravo blah, blah, and just bring you the component based on the fact that the list is within the ID itself. So we have jQuery on our page. We have no conflict running, right? So that we know that we're talking specifically to our jQuery library. We can get around various aspects of Visualforce. When we're actually using jQuery and we want things to run as quickly as possible, the next thing we need to do is just sort of remember in general how jQuery is basically working. One of the things I find is that jQuery makes things so convenient that it's very easy to write bad JavaScript with it. Remember that that first line, when we say item equals p ID of item, what jQuery is basically doing is going into a tree. It's a magic tree. It has both apples and oranges, right? And you're telling jQuery, go find me 5 of those oranges. And so it goes in the tree, and it shakes the tree, and it grabs those 5 oranges, and it hands those 5 oranges to you. And that process to us seems very fast, but it's relatively processor intensive. It's actually one of the most intensive things that jQuery can actually do. And jQuery would prefer not to do it again if it doesn't have to. So the first thing we can do is we can take those oranges, and if we know we're going to need them again, just hold them into a variable. Just store them into a variable, because if you don't, if you keep using jQuery, go grab me this P with this class or this ID, you're just basically telling it to throw the oranges away, and then 5 minutes later, go back to the tree, shake it all over again, find those 5 oranges, so you have the exact same response, right? Also, just in general, IDs are faster than classes. So if you're going to find CSS selection and you have the advantage of using ID versus class, use ID versus class. It's a different front door that jQuery uses in order to go up the tree and find those oranges, and it's a faster front door than going through the class structure. If we can give jQuery as many tips and clues and hints as possible to find those branches and find those oranges, that also will make jQuery faster for you. It delimits the number of nodes that it has to go down before it starts finding those oranges versus those apples. And finally, always remember that generally speaking, if it has the context, jQuery has this. And this is a reference to whatever item it's currently looking at. So the 2 most common use cases, for instance, if you're going through an iterator already knows what this is. If you're going through an event structure like a click or a mouse down or a mouse over, the context of the element that has that event is going to be available via this variable. Don't need to go hunt down which was the button that somebody clicked or anything like that. jQuery is holding on to that apple right there for you. Just grab it and go with it. Don't make it go find anything else. We can use then all of this together. And almost every function that we see in jQuery, most of the plugins that are out there, also try to have some kind of chaining-based structure that we're seeing at the bottom here. This also keeps jQuery from having to go back through the skeleton structure of the node itself, the DOM structure itself. Because what it's doing is that at the end of every one of these results, it's handing off what the next function is actually going to have to do. And so there's no CSS selection, which is going from one chain to the next chain to the next chain. And you'll see this a lot in a lot of Jason's demo code, where what we can do is we can just do all of the functions we want to do against that element in one long chain. And it's very, very fast as opposed to putting that through multiple lines. Now, Jason and I have been doing this for a few years, and we've been talking a little bit about how jQuery for us has actually changed over the years. And one of the earlier sessions we did a few years ago was all about using jQuery for widgets and user interfaces and using jQuery mobile and all of this stuff. We're finding more and more that jQuery still has, it's almost back to its roots at this point. We have so much development when it comes to Angular and Ionic and Polymer and all of these very powerful user interface MVC-based frameworks. But jQuery still has this excellent ability to provide utility functions for those. And so we should keep jQuery to be good at what jQuery is good at doing. Allow it to be the glue to these other frameworks, because Angular is going to allow you to create very complicated user interfaces in a very manageable way, for instance. And then jQuery may be able to assist it when it finds like events between buttons or events between divs. Always use plugins, like before we start coding our own charts or anything like that. jQuery has an awesome plugin structure, so before we decide to code our own, go out there and see if there's one that's already pre-existing. And finally, and I don't know how many people saw my HTML5 presentation from yesterday, but this is a shorter version of the preaching that I did at the HTML5 session yesterday. We have two technologies within Visualforce, which are designed from the get-go to be extremely JavaScript friendly for a couple of reasons. One is JavaScript remoting, and the other one is remote objects. JavaScript remoting allows us to take Apex methods, annotate them, static Apex methods, annotate them with remote action, and expose them directly down to JavaScript. There's two main advantages to this. Number one, there's no view state. And every time I say this word, I have to ask because I'm doing like a mental calculation of statistics of how many people know this. How many people here know what a view state is? Okay, that's actually a way higher percentage than I normally get. So view state is that hash component which goes from client to server and back down to client. And it's very nice for doing things like re-render within Visualforce, but as your data gets bigger, so does the view state. And the view state is not particular. If you have a bunch of data bound down to your Visualforce components and you're just trying to do one little interaction in JavaScript, that whole view state is still going to have to come back to the right if you're using Apex form or action function. JavaScript remoting does not do that, does not use any kind of view state. It's just a conversation between the client and the server. Client asks the question, server sends back an asynchronous response. You have a function handler back on JavaScript. Much faster, and it also scales. So if your page gets more complicated, you throw more data to it, you bind more data down in Visualforce, that JavaScript remoting function is going to keep working just as fast as it did before. Now, we just released remote objects generally available to developers. It's in all of your developer editions. We just released it this last summer, and I'm very happy to see it out there in the world of development, and you don't have to worry about it being a beta or a pilot or anything like that anymore. It's easily my most favorite feature of Visualforce in the entire history of Visualforce. Remote objects are basically the same concept and scope of JavaScript remoting. The nice thing is it has a functionality kind of like a standard controller, right? Like a standard controller is intended so that you as the developer don't have to keep writing a whole bunch of baseline Apex code, which does create, read, update, delete. For us, when you do that on an account versus a contact, the code's always going to be like 99% the same. And because we track all of your custom objects and your custom fields and all of that through metadata, we can guess the other like 1 to 2% of the differences. So that's why when you're doing basic Visualforce structures, you don't have to write that code. You can just use the standard controller. So I was actually talking with some of the guys on the Visualforce team, and we just sort of all came to the same realization, like, why are we forcing people to do that in JavaScript remoting? Right? We have this convenience on the baseline level of Visualforce functionality. Why aren't we offering that convenience to JavaScript remoting? And the answer to that question was remote objects. With the remote object components, what you get is you get a library which provides a client-side data model of your choice. So you would say like contact, you pick the fields that you want on contact. The JavaScript library already has the exact same data transport JavaScript remoting does. So it can talk right up to your data layer. No Apex required whatsoever. So now your you can write purely in JavaScript, and if you need to do create, read, update, delete, and queries, you don't have to have a corresponding Apex class just to get that basic functionality done. And then you can actually replace those functions with Apex methods or add new Apex methods if you want to. So very similar structure as to like a standard controller and custom extensions. Now you can use remote objects and JavaScript remoting. Finally, neither of those use the API scope. Many JavaScript developers get in the habit of trying to access like our REST API. Visualforce, it should not have to use the API scope. Obviously, there may be some use cases where you have to, or if you're using like the streaming API, which only has its own existence within the streaming API. Visualforce doesn't need to be calling into that API scope and pulling down your limits. Like that's for your third-party devices, your third-party applications, things over here. Visualforce is a first-class citizen on the platform and should not have to be soaking those limits whatsoever. Okay, so enough on the soapbox. I am going to hand things over to Jason, who actually does this for a living and has to put things into production for customers. And he's going to show you a little bit about what they've been working on.
Cool. Thank you, Josh. All right. So I just realized I actually need to log into an org really quick here just to show something. So let me do that. So what I'm going to show here is just our application that we show on the App Exchange, just to set a baseline of kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, if it loads, because the Wi-Fi is kind of weak here. Cool, so here's our application that we have in Salesforce, and it allows people just to like kind of search for record and view it on a map. And so that's pretty basic, but what we focused on is really making this web version feel like a native mobile version. The way we do that is with GPU accelerated animations, smooth transitions between the pages to really provide that client-side native feel. And so one thing you'll notice is when I click on these pins, this panel opens from the bottom, and it's really smooth and crisp. And this is on a web version, but it's also really smooth and crisp on a mobile device as well. And the reason for that is we're using like GPU accelerated animations. And so a lot of times the old JavaScript, it would actually do like modifying the DOM constantly in a big loop, which is really slow and inefficient. And the new CSS3 transitions use the hardware on the device, like the GPU, the graphics processing unit, to make sure everything is really smooth and responsive. And if you want to have rich mobile apps, that's what you've got to use. And so one thing I would like to show is how we can build kind of these transitions in a mobile context, because everybody's going mobile. Salesforce One's a big, important app and where you want your application. And so let me go ahead and pull up our demo here. And so I'm actually using JQuery within the context of Angular. And so Angular is a bigger conversation, not something we necessarily need to talk about today, but it just allows you to structure your code and your application in a modular manner. So you can build functionality into little tiny components and reuse those throughout your application. And so what we've got here on our page, so here's just a Visualforce page, and there's a lot of extra like CSS and JavaScript included. But the main thing I want to mention and highlight is just this single line here. And if you're familiar with HTML, you're like, what the heck is bar menu? I don't recognize that. All I know is about divs and spans. And so what you've done here, what we've done is basically created our own custom HTML element and then provided custom functionality. So whenever this is included on the page, we've basically defined a new spec for HTML. And what we can do is you can see you can define custom attributes here, and there's one called menu items, and I'm passing in, looks like just free text here called menu items. But that actually is linked to a JavaScript object, which is just an array of objects itself, including things like color and color and icon. And so what we want to do is actually build a mobile UI where it's a menu that allows people to quickly access information and transition between these different pages, if you will, to access the car app, the database app, the charting app, or the cloud app. And so one thing we can do is basically, let me just show you what this is going to look like all said and done. So this is basically our end result, right? So we've got this nice mobile optimized menu, big buttons, nice clean colors, crisp icons. And so when we click on one of these icons, what it will do is you'll see it actually like reload the page, or it'll basically, the item that's selected, it'll expand it and slide it out of the way. And so I'll click on the car here, you can see it expands and slides out of the way. And this is a good user interface for a couple reasons. The main one is it's extremely obvious what the user has selected. Because on a mobile device, there's lots of little tiny buttons. It's not always clear what you touched. And so here, it's really obvious. It gets really big. OK, I know I touched the green icon here. And sliding it out of the way provides context. It lets the user know that they've navigated to a different part of the application. And they know they've gone basically to the right. If they want to go back, which I haven't animated, you have this mental picture of a landscape of where you're at. And so you can slide back, get back to the menu, and go back and forth. And these transitions provide obvious clarity to what the user's doing and provides context to where they're currently located inside of your application. And so how do we do all this? So one thing with all the animations, it's not easy to do this stuff. I mean, it's kind of complicated in terms of just like the CSS code. It's messy, it's verbose. And so what we're actually using is a jQuery plugin called Transit. And I chose Transit just because the documentation is awesome. There's lots of really simple examples. You can just hover over all these elements on the page here and see exactly how they work. And so this is what we're actually using to do all those rich 3D, or 2D and 3D accelerated animations. And so back in our application, this is the final result, but how do we get there? So we've got basically our collection of menu items, which are colors and icons. And so what's great about this is hard-coded, but you could potentially retrieve this from a server dynamically. The settings could be changed by an admin to change colors, icons, etc. And so the thing that's worth noting here is this is within the context of Angular, and that's just important to note because jQuery and Angular can play nice. A lot of people think, okay, I have Angular, I don't need jQuery anymore. That's kind of old-fashioned. It was 5 years ago. It's not relevant, but it still really is. And you use it more to build kind of these focused features, not so much using jQuery for the entire application. And so this is kind of specific to Angular, but basically what happens is when this bar menu item is included on the page, there is a function inside of Angular that will execute. So it's just a link function. So it basically links the code to that element on the page. And then it just runs through it top to bottom like a normal function would. But it passes in a couple of items here. And so one of them worth noting is that menu item. So menu item is actually what we had on the page as well. So it's actually passing that collection of objects inside of this page. And if I pull up the console here, you can see the first thing we do is actually log all those menu items. And you'll see those are exactly what was inside of that controller. So we have the color and the icon. And so the next step is to actually build out the HTML structure. And we do that pretty simple in this example. There's lots of other ways to do that with using templating engines, but we're just going to do it old-fashioned way, building a string of HTML. But the first thing we have to do is make sure we get the right height and width of all the elements that we're actually going to be building out to build that menu. Because this could be on an iPhone, it could be on an iPad, it could be even on a desktop as well. So some things we need to know are the height of the window, the width of the window, and do some calculations there to build out our menu. So jQuery provides a really easy mechanism to get to those attributes of the document you're living in. And so I'm just using the dollar symbol here for sake of simplicity. And so that's basically saying jQuery, go look at the window and get the height. And then we're also getting the width as well. They're saying jQuery, go look at the window and get the height. And so one thing I'm not doing here is reusing this selection of window. And so what I should be doing to have this be totally optimized is store that selection in a variable and then reference that again and again instead of repeating the same code over and over. And so once we've got the dimensions of the window, we can actually start to set the height of those elements in our menu. And so we're basically just saying, okay, what's the height of the window, and how many menu items do we have, and just do some basic division there to set a dynamic height. And that way, if the screen size is different, the menus will always take up the full screen. Now we're also setting the font size appropriately as well, based on those dimensions, so that the icons themselves scale with the size of the device. If it's a small device, the icons will be small. If it's a big device, the icons will be big. So it's just some basic math here. And so once we've got all those, we can actually start to build out the HTML itself. And so what we're doing is actually just building a string of HTML. And like I mentioned before, there's lots of templating engines to kind of automate this process. But this is pretty simple, it's explanatory, and it's extremely fast. This is still the fastest way to construct HTML for your page. And so what we're doing is we're actually looping through all those menu items. And so I outputted those menu items here. You can see there's the first one has a color of the 28ABEE, and it's a car. And so what we're doing is for each menu item, we're constructing a div, and we're passing in those attributes dynamically. So for the height, we're saying, what was the height that we calculated before for each one of those items? We're passing in the color. And we're doing the same thing for the icon as well. And so once we've done this, we've looped through all those elements, we've basically got this big string of HTML. And you can see that here. So this is the HTML that we've created. And if I save this, or if I comment that out, at this point, when I reload the page, nothing is there. So nothing's happened. I've built that HTML, but it's just being stored in a string inside of my JavaScript. The next step is actually add it to the page. And so that's one thing about modifying the DOM. Even within the context of Angular, sometimes you need jQuery to do these DOM-type modifications. And so what we're doing is, another little thing that Angular does is when we include this particular element on the page, Angular will give that to our function. Say, this is the element that we're currently working on. And so jQuery can use that. And so we're basically saying, okay, jQuery, for that, go find that element that we're currently working on. And the HTML structure inside of that element, set it to the menu HTML that is that giant string of a bunch of divs representing our menu. So I uncommented that, and then I'm actually going to comment this and redeploy. So now I reload the page, and we've got the nice structure that we've built out dynamically based on that potentially differing input, that JavaScript object with all the colors and the icons. But now when I click on it, nothing is happening. And so what we need to do is attach what jQuery refers to as event listeners. And so we do that by finding the elements on the page we want to listen for when someone clicks or touches it. And you'll see that when we built out those HTML menu items, we gave them a class of menu bar item. So that's each one of those colors is a menu bar item. And so we're saying, okay, jQuery, go find all of the elements on the page that have the class menu bar item, and then listen for a click. And that click happens, run the function below. So I have console.hi on there. What we want to do is call in a function called expand menu item. And I can include some other ones in here just to show that why we're separating this is you could have explode menu item, flip menu item. It could be a setting a user selects where you dynamically change the animations. And so when they click that element, it's actually going to run this function right here. And the concept that I want to point out here is this concept of this. And so this is the element that was literally touched on the page. So on the demo here, if I touch the green item, that's what this is representing, because that is the element that we associate our event listener with. And so we can actually take that element that was clicked and then pass that to a bunch of different functions. In this example, we're just sending it to one expand menu item, but we could send it to expand menu item, change font color, a bunch of different things that basically interact with the UI. And so expand menu item is actually, this is all of our animation framework, all of our animation code. And you can see it's really simple. It's only a couple lines of code. And so we're passing in this, which was the element that was touched. And we're passing it to this function argument called menu item. And so one thing you'll notice, it has like a $sign in front of it. It's not really relevant other from a syntax perspective. It just lets the developers know that this particular item is coming from jQuery. It was selected with jQuery. So when someone else looks at this, they're like, oh, I see the variable name has a $sign in front of it. I can probably do all this cool jQuery stuff with it. It just kind of helps like self-document the code. And so now we can do all that animation. And so we've got that menu item that was clicked. And this transition here is just invoking that third-party library to do all the animation. Typically, you think about animation as pretty complex. You need to calculate the time, the duration, the easing effects. Lots of stuff goes into it, but here it's really simple. And so what we're doing is we're actually just setting the height of the element that was touched to the window height that we had saved earlier, like the first thing we did. And so that's what expands it really tall. And then we have this concept of chaining. So you can see there's two transitions here. The first one is it gets height really tall, and then when that's complete, the next transition will run. And what that's doing is setting the x coordinate. Think of like x and y. It's basically sliding it all the way to the left by doing kind of a -1. So it slides it negative 500 pixels to the left. So it makes it big, slides it out of the way. You can see that not happening because I need to save. Let's reload. And so you can see that happening really quickly. It basically just makes it big, slides it out of the way. And one other minor detail that kind of adds polish to the whole process is we're also collapsing all of the other elements next to the one that was touched. And so this is where jQuery provides lots of really neat utility functions for interacting with the DOM. So if I go back to this page, you'll see that when I click on the green one, all the other items collapse. And so how do I find those other items in a quick, efficient way? And so Salesforce actually has a way to do that called siblings. And so if we look at the source code of this, you'll see that there's this div here in the middle. That's the chart icon. But then there's all these other divs with the menu bar item next to it. And so any item directly next to this particular DOM element is considered a sibling. And so what we're saying is, OK, for that menu that was touched, go find all of the siblings and do a transition on all of those. So everything that was found, we're going to make the height 0. And that minor detail makes the UI animation here really polished. If it just gets really big, it kind of overlap everything and then slide out. It's just a minor detail that kind of makes it look pretty and look nice. So that's one thing that you can do with jQuery animations. And so this is just a really quick example, but it covers a couple concepts in terms of like what is this, how do you chaining, finding siblings. And so siblings is just one, but there's things like parent, descendants, the previous element. There's so many utility functions you don't have to reuse or rewrite yourself. And so that's the demo, pretty much. And hope you liked it, but the source code will be out there. It's all on GitHub. And this is just how you can start to use jQuery on a web page, but also within the context of a larger framework without it getting in the way with something like Angular or Knockout or some of the other ones that are out there.
Very, very cool.
Thank you.
And we will post the GitHub link up onto the chatter feed afterwards.
Yep.
All right. So we have about 5 minutes left on the clock. And so if anybody has any questions, we will take those now. Yes. What tools do you use to track jQuery's performance?
Yeah, so pretty much use Chrome exclusively. There's two things you can track that when basically your application is being slow. There's the computational piece of the JavaScript itself. And so Chrome provides a very easy mechanism called CPU profiling. It's basically when is the CPU getting super saturated. And that's in the developer console. And I can show you that later if you want. That's one way that jQuery can be slow. Another way is you're invoking a change to the UI that's slow. And that's not necessarily a CPU-intensive process, but it's more of a UI-intensive process. And that's typically when you're in the rendering world, they call it painting. They're like repainting the screen. And there's also, in Chrome as well, a way to see what are the slowest paint operations. And you can actually see what's spiking and then drill down on the method that's causing the problem. And once you have it drilled down the method, you're really going to be kind of going to old-fashioned debugging, isolating console time, time start, time end, to really isolate the part that's the slowest. So I can show you some stuff if you want to come up after.
This may be a little low level. With the console, you have the ability to, it has a JavaScript library with it, integration toolkit that allows you to add tabs, navigate around, right? What jQuery method are we to use to detect that your tab has reloaded? Is that an onload? Because it looks like it's changing the contents of the HTML, but I don't think that there's an actual page reload going on.
So which tab?
So you know the console, the sales
Like
console,
Service Console.
Oh, yeah.
right? Service console.
I know, I was thinking developer console too.
Yeah.
There's so many
Oh,
consoles out
sorry,
there.
yes.
No, totally
not that
understand.
console.
I'm actually honestly not super familiar with
Yeah,
the
I have
console.
not. I've talked with a couple of JavaScript developers who have gone down that road. I haven't tried it myself. There is an event where the DOM changes, but it's not widely supported, and so it may be difficult to catch the event itself unless you can inject a handler onto the DOM. If you can do that, then you could detect the actual click of the tab, and then you could react to it. The
Oh,
only
right,
other
like
trick I
inline.
can think of is determining if the CSS has changed on the tab.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Yes.
So in the two techniques that you showed to include the scripts, is there a good practice to always refer to the latest version that's available?
So,
Because,
I struggle to try to recommend one over the other because I find the development teams kind of pick their path and what works for them and doesn't break their code is kind of what they do. What I have started doing in general is one of those three, right? I've actually just now starting, I don't know how many people have gotten into the practice of putting script tags towards the bottom of the body for performance. That is like kind of, that's one tip for performance. Another one is that if your browser group is modern enough, script tags now have support for an attribute called defer in async, which can control the flow if they're being loaded into the header. So the latest group of demos that I've done JavaScript-wise, I've used the script tag instead of include script because include script does not currently support that feature. And so I've been doing script tags in the header using async and defer pointing to static resources. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, go ahead and come out
I think
after.
so.
We'll
Okay.
talk about it.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Oh, we are getting the T for time. So I want to thank everybody. You're an awesome audience. Enjoy Dreamforce, and I'll see you around the dev zone.